Portland State is located on the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbian River. We acknowledge the ancestors of this place and understand that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. We recognize and honor the past, present, and future of these communities. We also pause to recognize and acknowledge the labor upon which our country, state, and institution are built. We remember that our country is built on the labor of enslaved people who were abducted and brought to the U.S., and we recognize the continued contribution of their descendants. We also acknowledge labor of all immigrants, voluntary and involuntary, that contributed to the building of the country and continues within our labor force. We acknowledge that our institution relies on hourly, student, contingent, and unpaid labor, and we recognize those contributions. Finally, we acknowledge the value of unpaid caregiving labor and the challenges that result from conflicts between caregiving, paid labor, school, and other communities, and other commitments. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It is December 28th, 2020. Welcome to the Fifth Avenue podcast presented by the Fifth Avenue Cinema, Oregon's only student-run cinema. A podcast about drag kings, drag queens, and all that's in between. My name is Tracy. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am the host of this podcast, or now co-host, but we'll find out a little bit more about that later. And I would like to shout out this week the third day of Kwanzaa, which is Ujima, which recognizes collective work and responsibility in our communities. That's all I got. And I am joined by none other than...
This is Madi Lou. They use they, them pronouns, and I'm still the cinema coordinator of Fifth Avenue Cinema. And today my shout out, despite their attempts to say I can't do this, goes out to my old roommate Sawyer, who told me and asked if I missed the 35 milliliter projector. They forgot that milliliters are not how you measure film, and since I know that they don't listen to this podcast, I'm going to shout them out anyways. And I am also joined here with...
Owen. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am the publicity coordinator. Catch me on the gram, on Twitter, Facebook. And my shout out... My shout out is going to go to the Queen SZA for dropping Good Days. Been playing it on repeat ever since it came out.
Chiming in just to say yes, sir.
I'm joined by...
Nayeli, and I use she, they pronouns, and I am the podcast editor. My shout out goes to my boyfriend, who is the only person who I've been seeing. All I've been doing is watching YouTube and hanging out with him. And he bought me some really cool watercolor brushes that I'm very excited to use. And today we have another person joining us who is...
Hello, I'm Genevieve. I'm the new podcast co-host. I use she, her pronouns. I wasn't prepared to give a shout out, but I guess I will give a shout out to my parents for buying me DVDs for Christmas, because I love them.
I also just want to say really quick, it's funny to me to, for context, Genevieve is also a film major with Tracy. And it's funny because I think both of you now have talked about family just being like, here are DVDs. And that's really, funny to me personally to be like, you like movies? Here's some movies. So it would be like if everyone got me a pride flag. I don't know. It's just, yeah.
No, isn't it people get you, gay literature or something?
Yes. Okay. So on the topic of gay literature, the movie we're going to talk about today is VENUS BOYZ from 2002, which you can stream through Canopy as well as the PSU library search engine if you look it up and if you have a library card. But in general, we're going to be talking about drag kings. And for context, for anyone who might not know, drag kings are the binary counterpart to drag queens. It's that playing on masculinity as a performance rather than femininity. And this documentary is made talking to a lot of different people. I would say that it's specifically focused around people who are assigned female at birth, whether they identify as cis women or none or trans men. And As a heads up to anyone who might feel uncomfortable, the language is from 2002, so keep that in context when watching it, because I know personally as someone who is trans, I still always kind of flinch when people call themselves transsexual and like transvestites, because like I had that used against me and still do within family settings. So like just a heads up, like even if it's not self-deprecating or transphobic in the context of people talking about themselves, it is different language than we typically use in 2020. So that's just a little side note to anyone who is watching this. But
also, it is very graphic. It is a very graphic movie, which I didn't realize beforehand. And so when it actually came to it, I was like, oh, okay. So, you know, there is nudity. Just saying.
What is a drag king? I want to know. I'm here to tell you, brothers and sisters, drag king is a person who wants gender euphoria. A drag king is a person who has accepted their female masculinity. Amen.
But yeah, I would love to hear what my coworkers have thought about this movie, as I'm the person who programmed it, so you know I got more than enough to say about it.
Okay, at first I wasn't really sure how to feel, although to be fair, I was hungry. So like when I'm hungry, I'm kind of like annoyed by everything. So so at first I was like, oh, okay, like this is very like an early 2000s low budget documentary, and like in terms of like the editing style, it's like those 90s vids, or I don't really know how to describe it.
It reminds me of those ads, you wouldn't steal a car, like that kind of editing of early 2000s. That's what I thought the whole time, just on your comment of editing, like those advertisements talking about piracy before movies when you watch DVDs in the early 2000s.
You wouldn't download a car.
Yeah. Kind of sort of what Maddie already said, in that it is like, I guess, older language and an older viewpoint, and so it's very interesting for me as, I guess, a more young queer it's always interesting seeing stuff like footage of queer people. I'm going to use that term because I prefer using that term, of the like older generations and how they identify and what their opinions on certain topics are. I always really like seeing that. It always helps me give a new perspective, and also kind of helps me get out of this kind of bubble that I feel like a lot of young teenage queer people sometimes can get into, that I have seen my own sibling get into, and I'm like, it's kind of just the problem with having a lot of your elders not be around anymore because of a epidemic.
Yeah. Can I follow that up with a comment, if that's okay?
Mm-hmm.
Not to plug more movies that you should go and watch, but there's a movie, I believe the title is The Silent Generation, which is specifically talking about queer elders, and talking about the fact that speaking for queer people, like, we tend to put elders down specifically because, like, of the preconceived notions that they hold that they don't want to change, which kind of goes for anyone across identities. Like, people have that generational gap of, like, conflict because language evolves and, like, general, like, culture differs from year to year. But in the context of this movie, it's really interesting to see queer people being parents while also being, like, in this performative role, because this is one of the only movies that I've seen where it's, like, it's normal that someone is mom at home with a kid and is, like, Sir Dicks a lot on stage. Like, that's me making up a name on the spot to, like, emphasize how, like, over masculine it is. But, like, it's really neat to me personally as someone who very much does that kind of gender performance a lot, to be able to also just be, like, a normal quote unquote role at home. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah. So I really enjoyed that part of it. But, like, I guess in general, there were parts that I really connected with and parts that I didn't really at all. I guess personally, the people and I guess stories that I connected with the most was Dredd and his grandson, or like that's how they called each other, and the mom. I forgot his name.
Diane
but yeah,
Tor.
those are,
Diane Tor.
Yeah, Diane Tor. Those three like were kind of like my favorite people and personalities and stories within the documentary.
For me, I was engaged throughout, but when I really got engaged was when it got to being about Dredd and Luscious and Storm Weber, the grandson that Niley was referring to. Mainly because personally, when watching this movie, the first few minutes, I was interested in seeing how this space because it seems like this film is set obviously in New York, but like in a scene in a specific club that is like that's very specific. Like it doesn't go across different clubs or different groups of drag kings or what have you. It seems like it's like this like cohort maybe, and I was interested to see where it gets complicated by the presence of black people. So I was interested in seeing, and Dredd is on the cover, so I was like, I want to see that person. Where is that person? And
yes, sorry, can I interrupt you for a second? At the beginning, I was really confused because I was only seeing white people, and I'm like, wait a minute, isn't like the cover the black person?
Yeah, Ella made the same comment. I was like, I was trying to like give the film a little like, I was like, all right, maybe they'll show up at some point, and then they did, and I was like, okay, finally to be not. And I'm not saying that the movie is without any value before that or after that, but it was really engaged. I was really engaged with that part because, especially in the early 2000s, we read about complications of like queer culture, queer identity when it comes to blackness, and how black people are often left out of like the general queer like conversation. And I was interested in seeing how it was fit into an earlier context like 2002 and a culture and culture like drag kings, because that doesn't really, at least I haven't seen much about other than like actually seeing drag kings perform. And I found it really interesting because Dredd seemed almost like completely free in their like not existence, identity and presentation that they do on stage and everything. Very free, very embracing all elements of it all, and it was very beautiful to see. And the relationship between them and Storm Weber, which is like I've been told is a legend. I believe it. Still living, still teaching creative writing. Is that what you said? Yeah, yes. Teaching creative writing in UW, yeah, which is pretty dope. Great poet, black indigenous person. But yeah, I was interested in their part mainly because it got to the complicated parts of this. It isn't like everyone kind of speaks, and I don't mean this to like discredit the film, but a lot of the white people in this film, they speak mainly about just like a lot of binary shit for the most part. It's like man, woman, penis, yeah. And then when it comes to like Dredd and Storm, they get to like deeper and more nuanced efforts. Like Storm brings up the idea that this is within our African and indigenous cultures, is where like there are two-spirit people. There are people they're still two-spirit people. They didn't go anywhere. But there are people who we sought to as healers in our ancestral traditions, who like engage with what they called at the time in this film cross-dressing, but engage with that fluidity of self, of presentation. And it was just fascinating because there was a lot said in that section of the film that is almost like not even dominating, but like a very big part of the conversation today, specifically within like black queer circles, where we're speaking about the idea that there was never these type of people back in Africa or back in like our older days in the 20s, 1880s, whatever, but there always has been. And I thought that was very interesting to be put into this film.
I also wanted to say that like you made this comment, Tracy, and Nayeli as well. I was worried when like 15 minutes in it had only been white people, because I'm like, oh shit, is this going to be that like they have the token diverse like one visibly black person and they put them on the cover? Because in general, that's sadly something that happens a lot. Like, this is a terrible example, but I think about that reimagining of Stonewall movie that came out in like the mid 2010s, and God, it was fucking awful and whitewashed, and they had like 2 black trans women on the front. Like, they had women of color where it's like, yeah, that's how it was, and then it was just all white cis gay men. So I was worried about that, but it was really interesting to me, and I'm glad that you brought this up, Tracy, the fact that, like, specifically having two Black people, and in general, I feel like everyone who is, like, identified themselves as not white talked more outside of the binary, which, like, very much speaking from a white perspective, I feel like the societal heteronormative view imposed within the binary on people is kind of, like, catering to what is, like, normal, in big air quotes, of society, which is you're white, you're able-bodied, you're middle class, you're cis, you're heterosexual. Like, that's kind of very much, you obviously deviate from that by being not cis, by being someone who performs gender, but, like, you're still white. And I feel like, personally, I see this a lot with people who are like, I hold a minority card, so, like, I don't have to apologize for my whiteness. And I'm like, that's really not how it works, though. Like, you're still white, you still hold white privilege. Just because you're trans or you're queer, it doesn't automatically make you, quote-unquote, as marginalized. Like, I hate the oppression Olympics syndrome that people get into, but especially white marginalized people tend to have a, like, self-deprecating need to be seen as othered as other people. And I'm like, that's something that I feel like this film kind of falls into a little bit, which, like, this isn't to discredit drag kings as being mainstream. Like, they aren't. Like, in general, a lot of people don't realize drag kings are a thing, because, like, to any listener now, you've definitely heard of RuPaul's Drag Race. Like, that's a thing that I feel like is very mainstream, and people are aware that because of that, drag queens exist. But, like, drag kings as a performance, it's something like people who do burlesque. Like, it's a performance. Some people hold it within their identities, but typically it's something that you're getting paid to do, or you're doing because you're passionate about it and you're doing it on a stage. It's not necessarily something you carry with you everyday in visible life. Like, for a lot of trans people it is, and there are trans people within drag king and queen circles, but that's something that people conflate a lot, because it's like, oh, so you're a trans woman but you're dressing up as a woman, or oh, you're a trans man but you're dressing up as a man, and it's like, it's all bullshit anyways. Like, I hate to be the asshole queer academic person, but, like, Judith Butler, for as much as she has controversy around her, I feel like her theory of gender as a performance really summarizes the fact that, like, all of this is made up anyways, so to get all nitpicky about how someone's doing it right or wrong is just being shitty on purpose. Like, I don't know, personally, I'm so detached from gender performance, especially within the pandemic. Like, I haven't been binding for months, and I generally forget that I'm perceived. So when someone calls me sir or ma'am in public, I'm like, what? Who? Oh, me, yeah. Sure, ma'am, sir, that's fine, I guess. Because I just forget. Like, I'm just at 7-Eleven at 3 a.m. in my pajamas. I don't fucking know what I look like. Like,
I just wanted to say with that, or like how you were saying about how some people hold it within their day-to-day lives, and some people do and some people don't. And, like, honestly, while I was seeing this, and as I've seen other performances as well, like by drag queens as well, like, it's literally just theater. And I know you guys, I know, Tracy, you just, you know, want to leave. But, like, it's literally just theater. And I think there's a reason why there's so many gay people in theater, because that's performance. They're talking about their characters and whatever. And it's so funny because I hadn't really made this big connection before until I saw this movie, which is wild because I have been following, like, drag queen culture, and, you know, I'm a theater kid and I know, you know, all these things. But, like, it really is. Like, they're just doing theater. They're doing their one man, one woman show.
That makes me smile because personally, I can't remember what their name is, but the person that the film opens up with, who, like, has the shaved head and does, like, two different kinds of performance. Like, they perform as, like, the feminine, hyper feminine versus the hyper masculine. Like, they do both. And they talk about how it's like, I think I think they identified as a woman and talked about how men are intimidated by a woman who is like okay with being masculine, and they talked about like women finding them attractive because it was like masculine in a healthy way, and they're like, I wish I didn't just like men, which like shout out to all the women who are like, it would be nice to be into women, but I'm not, because I'm like, but women are so beautiful. I digress. Like, in general, the performance that people put on as individuals, it's interesting to me because I have severe performance anxiety. Like, that's why I'm no longer a music major. I can't be on a stage for more than 2 seconds. So the fact that a lot of these people are doing it alone, and like the performance that they're doing is literally just like not necessarily making fun at, but it's poking the big bear that is heteronormativity and like homosocialization of like, this is what you're supposed to look like, and it's like, no, I'm going against that. So yeah.
In the vein of performance, there was, I don't remember who said it, but there was a quote I really liked where they were talking about how they like incorporate their like quote unquote asshole qualities into their character to like healthily express that, which I thought was really interesting. And then like somebody else said like instead of being like an angry woman, they're like turned into like a powerful, a confident man character, which I just think is so interesting because I never would have thought of like performing like a different, I guess what I was thinking is from what I know about like drag queens, which does unfortunately mostly just come from Drag Race. It's kind of like it's not, you don't hear anyone talk about their reasons like that deeply. Like it doesn't seem as tied to being tired of like performing like manhood in the way that like I feel like a lot of women get tired of performing womanhood and femininity because it takes a lot out of you. And I think other like people in the documentary acknowledged that.
Yeah, no, Genevieve, I really like what you said as far as like performance of womanhood is tiring, because I think that I have been forcefully assigned female at birth. I'm like, I don't know, saying it like that is funny to me, but like for anyone who is socialized as female growing up, it's a lot more performing than I feel like people who were raised socially as men get. Like the whole like, be quiet, be proper, don't take up that much space, you need to be caring, you need to be empathetic. And I feel like not that people who are socialized as male don't get that, but I feel like the saying boys will be boys versus she was asking for it, those are obviously two different levels, but like in taking that into an adult view of like, you can choose how you perform gender, or you can generally like make fun of the way that socialization is so fucking whack. Like, raise boys and girls the same is something that gets not thrown around a lot, but it's a thing that I feel like I see people say it more, and I'm glad that I see people say it more, because it's weird to me to think that like I grew up being told like, stop sitting like that because everyone can see your vagina, like with sitting with a dress, and I'm like, what do you mean I have underwear on? And they're like, it's just not proper. I'm like, can I have some pants then? Like I generally didn't get it. And then seeing my brother growing up where it's like, bro, he's slouching worse than I was. Like, you're not getting on him about it. And it's like, oh, because I was a girl, in quotes, and he was a 6'12" Like, I don't know. It's just kind of like, it's interesting to me in that performance of it, that in that I feel like drag kings get more shit because of toxic masculinity, which is the subject that gets brought up in the film. But like, I don't know. I would love to hear like from Tracy or Owen, who are both like men within this realm of you have an opinion, etc. Like, do you guys feel like there is a lot of standards as far as being able to perform masculinity correctly? Because I know like, I personally feel like there's always that standard for femininity, but also my view as a trans person who typically leans towards being transmasculine is like, trying not to be toxically masculine while also being like, yes, I would prefer to be perceived as a man, not a woman. But to Owen or Tracy, I would love to open the floor to like what y'all think about the performance of masculinity.
Well, I'm trying to even stay on topic because that was a lot to process. But yes, I am the Minecraft Steve of the world. I'm the generic default skin. And that's what I'm here to talk about. Fuck. I think that there is some sort of performance to masculinity that is upheld for sure, especially in like sports culture. I was a part of that, especially in high school, and like being shit on for not even being like big enough to like body people off the ball, or random like, or not wanting to like decapitate people in a soccer game, which is just not right for the sport in general. But there's that performance thing, and then I think also with other men as well. I might veer off topic a little bit, but like I think there is an interesting double standard between like people being virgins and stuff like that, but just like how getting like men calling other men a virgin as like slander to them, very interesting, that I was thinking about the other day. I don't know, I'm just having a hard time even staying on topic right now, but yeah.
No, yeah, I feel where you're going, Owen. Except I am not the default, but I believe in general that it's kind of like a weird question, because this is not I don't think it's comparable. But there is a expectation of performing masculinity as someone growing up and being assigned male at birth, and sticking with that identity throughout. I believe that it is something that at least for me, and I have a specific lens as a black man, where an idea of masculinity is perceived all around me, but it's also coupled with a masculinization, I guess what it's called, of over black men, expecting this type of like attitude, this type of bravado, this type of sexual performance. Either hypersexualizing to black men is one of the things that kind of is also enforced upon us, either through societal needs and not necessarily through parenting or upbringing, but we're expected to be a certain way, and it is difficult to combat that, and it becomes a way where you can either be pushed away from community or find community. It's kind of either way. And in my experience, I mean, I don't think it matters in the context of this podcast, but I've experienced both before. Like, I've never really been I don't want to make myself sound like I'm different, because I'm not, but I've never been like a very quintessential like man in any way of form of any shape or form, or like even as a young boy, I was always kind of like not as masculine as I should be in a lot of people's eyes, and got bullied for it,
not part of the boys, right?
I was I've performed in a way where I had to be to make sure I don't to make sure that I am able to attain friendship, to obtain a sense of self, to where I'm not worried about what can happen to me, whatever, but it's not comparable to anyone else, to people that identify as women and people that identify as queer or whatever. Of course not, but there is like a performance of masculinity in like that I had to uphold in some ways that as an adult I am not as tied to, but I thought that it was interesting that you brought that up or floored that question to us, because I thought about, when watching the documentary, how a lot of the drag king performance, it's kind of like a basic take, but it's like a reflection and almost commentary on heterosexuality, and specifically within men and the toxicities of it. Like specifically with Diane Torres' character that she creates, forgot the name of the person but he is, like, Diane Torres explains that he's a person that Diane Torres does not like. This is a person that is a bad person, but is not very far off from what people would perceive to men to be. Even Diane Torres' daughter was like, which I thought was interesting, because Diane Torres' daughter had like a very alternative upbringing, and how I forgot the daughter's name, compared that character to her dad, where it's like, well, my dad's a nice guy. Does my mom think that all guys are like this? Like, but my dad is my idea of a man. It's like, obviously not every man is like that, which is interesting, because had their daughter been raised, like, I guess, quote unquote traditionally, it would not have been hard for her to find many of men that fit that role.
Yeah, I was interested in how Dan Tours did like workshops for like up and coming drag kings, I guess, and like how they acknowledged the performance of masculinity, and like saying, like he was saying at some point, like, you know, you have to toughen up, you got to be tougher, like you got to have that swagger. And I just thought that was really interesting that, like, I guess like it's true that as someone who's feminine, like you have to learn kind of how to have that masculinity, how to present that, because it is very different from what we're used to. And also I thought it was interesting that a lot of the drag kings commented on how when they are perceived as a man, they are treated a lot differently and almost like respected more, like listened to more. And I think that also relates to kind of like the performance of masculinity and like being like, I'm not gonna take shit from anyone and stuff.
This is kind of hard because there's a lot of things that are going through my mind that I want to talk about, and I'm sure it's like the same with Maddie, because there is a lot of stuff that is presented in the film, but I'm just going to save my quick little points and then be done with it. So, for one, the workshop thing, I also very enjoyed and was very interested in it, and it also reminded me of how there's also like workshops for trans women and how to be like quote unquote more feminine, and which has gotten both criticism and love for a variety of reasons. But like the point of it isn't necessarily to say that you have to be a certain way to be a woman, but it's more so some things were ingrained into AFAB people that weren't into AMAB people, and so there is a learning curve. And it was really interesting how like that kind of it kind of reminded me of that. Also, I wanted to touch upon something that I thought was really important that Dredd mentioned in the documentary about how when she is Dredd out in public, sometimes she has a hard time getting a cab because she is perceived as a black man. And maybe people will pay more attention to and respect a white man more, but maybe not a black man. And Tracy, if you want to add on to that.
One of the only things I wanted to add on to that was that I was very excited that she also mentioned that, like, she's like, even when I'm out as, like, you know, dressed as a woman, I still don't get a cab, because a lot of older documentaries and films like this, they subscribe to the notion that racism towards black people is only on the black man, it's on the black man's back, when it's not. And if anything, black women, black film center people get it worse. It's just that we are very hyper visible, and we also dominate the conversation, and by us I mean black men. So I love that she was also like, but as a woman I also don't get a cab too. And it was like a two-pronged discussion point that I feel like was a small moment in that film. And I think I can speak for you, Naila, saying that it hit, you know, like it was something that made enough an impression to where you wanted to bring it up now. Like I said earlier on, like a different point, like how I was interested in the intersections of race with this film and like in drag kings. That is, I don't think a lot of the other drag kings or white kings, they talk about white drag kings talk about how when they are perceived as men in public, they get treated better. They always talk about being treated better, but it's like, of course you're seen as a white man in public. Of course you be treated better, but Dredd makes it more interesting, not necessarily interesting, but more complicated and more nuanced. Where she was like, but when I'm perceived as a black man, it becomes way more complicated in the public public sphere, and becomes more of like a thing where we, in comparison to what the white kings experience, it definitely doesn't matter what gender you're expressing, you will be treated differently. The varying degrees of how you be treated differently depending on the gender, of course, it's a different context, but I found that part similarly to Naili very interesting, because she hasn't Dredd shed very interesting light on that part of the culture.
Yeah. And so my last thing that I wanted to mention, which is going back to the whole performativity of masculinity. Okay, so obviously, like, things are different now because we are younger generation and, you know, blah, blah, blah. But that conversation, or, like, what Tracy and I were talking about, kind of reminded me of a conversation that I had with my boyfriend the other day, in which, so, like, my boyfriend has long hair, and I'll paint his nails, and that can be seen as, like, somewhat feminine or whatever. And I was talking to him about that because, like, he's just a straight cis white guy, but he likes those things and he likes to play up his femininity sometimes. And it was really interesting because he told me that part of the reason why he does it is because he doesn't want to scare women when he's walking outside. Because he's like 6'3", he's really tall, and he specifically plays up his femininity so he doesn't scare people outside. Doesn't really like fully connect to everything that we're talking about, but it kind of is maybe something that maybe now men are thinking about and whatnot.
Yeah, no, I love that you said that, because I honestly, throughout all of this, think about the first time I was like visibly perceived as male, actually while walking home from Fifth Ave when I still lived in Southwest. I had these two people try to catcall me where they were talking about my ass, and I turned around and they're like, oh, fuck, it's a dude. I'm like, what? Like, I was just generally confused, where I'm like, I'm used to the catcalling, but then being perceived as male, like, automatically switched that with the, like, apologizing and being like, my bad. And I'm like, a dude can have a nice ass, though. Like, I don't know. Like, that's just to make fun of that. But it's weird, personally, where, like, right now within quarantine, my hair has gotten a lot longer, but, like, I've never been perceived as male. Like, I'm 2 years on testosterone, so at this point, I know logically that my voice is a lot lower, but personally, my inner monologue still sounds like my voice pre-T, so I forget that I get perceived as male. Like, it's really funny to have gone through a drive-thru once in these past 2 weeks and have someone say sir to me over the intercom, and then when I pull up, they're like, oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm like, what are you sorry about? Can I get my chicken nuggets? Like, I'm just like, I don't care. Like, it's weird to be perceived because I'm living in my apartment with my roommate, and that's it. Like, I talk to the people on this podcast, like my lovely coworkers, classmates when they're school, but like, other than that, I don't see people because we're living in a pandemic. So thinking about the performance of gender isn't something that's really come up for me, and that's really interesting, like, personally, because I used to have really crippling gender dysphoria until I started testosterone and got my name and sex legally changed. So, like, gender performance kind of involved every day for my life, because I'm like, how am I going to be perceived? I live with chronic pain, so binding is really hard, but I've been doing it for 7 years, just making my body worse. But, like, a lot of the times, if I didn't have the ability to bind because my back was acting up, I wouldn't go out, because I'm like, I'm going to be perceived as female because I have boobs. And that's something where I feel like there are classes and general, like, workshops for trans feminine people with, like, I know they get critiqued because it's like, oh, playing into the roles of women, which, fuck you. Like, I don't know. If you're someone who generally says that trans women shouldn't be allowed to be hyper feminine, or that trans femme people need to perform femininity to be able to be perceived as feminine, fuck you. Like, that's just stupid. Like, I can't beat around the bush. Personally, masculinity is the default and femininity is always demonized. Like, that's just the societal thing. It doesn't matter who's performing it. Femininity is seen as weak and masculinity is seen as power. And that's the whole thing. Like, that's kind of what I wanted to conclude on with this documentary, is playing with masculinity is great, but especially if you're a white person, you already hold the privilege of being white and being what is seen as the societal norm and acceptable identity. So, like, if you step into that role as a man and are handed the privileges of a white man, like, please acknowledge the fact that, like, that's a privilege. Like, you're handed more privilege, and that's not necessarily something that, like, everyone can do or necessarily wants to do. Like, I didn't start transitioning so that people would treat me as a man. And honestly, it's weird when people do. I'm like, what do you mean you don't want to threaten my life? Like, it's weird personally in the traumas that I have experienced to be passively perceived as cis, because I wear a shit ton of pride stuff. I very much am publicly queer and out myself as trans all the time, which has brought me a lot of transphobia and violence, and like, not to say I'm used to it, but it's like that's the experience, and I'm white, so it's like I live in Portland. I feel like Portland likes queer people more than it likes people of color, so I'm not worried about my life here. But as far as talking about the workshops on femininity, the concluding point I wanted to say is that I think masculinity is something that we as a society need to acknowledge is always going to be in that power dynamic. Like, it holds the role of, as much as we can say dismantle the binary, I think we first have to acknowledge the fact that the binary exists on a power hierarchy. In general, whether you hold a space as someone who's masculine or feminine, no matter your gender identity, masculinity is already given the power and the upholding, or is demonized in that sense of like masculinity being applied to like Black people, especially Black femmes, as being like the hyper violence, the etc., without any kind of preconceived notion of who the person actually is, or femininity is fragile and weak and like vulnerable, like the whole stereotype of like white women that get taken advantage of. And it's like, no, that's just white feminism, babe. So yeah, I don't know. I know that was a long stream of consciousness thing, but this is a film that you should definitely check out if you want to educate yourself more around what it is to be a drag king. But please take it with a grain of salt that this is from the early 2000s. In general, this is a documentary I would highly recommend for anyone, whether or not you are aware of drag king culture, because it's a great starting point to then further your research.
I play men. You see, I have a mustache, I play men, but I also play women.
Then you put a wig on it?
Yeah.
How do you like when you play men?
I like it a lot. It's fun.
It is, right?
It's fun because I'm not a man, so it's fun to put on that other gender.
Did you ever think to be a man?
No. It's more fun to me to play than I don't want to be a man. No.
Thank you for listening to the Fifth Avenue Podcast, where we come together talking to you about all things cinema. If you like today's show, please follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Fifth Avenue Cinema. That's Fifth Ave with a 5, where you can also reach us for questions or comments. You can also reach us by email at film@pdx.edu, and we hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as we enjoyed making it. We'll see you soon, and remember that all Black lives matter, and to please defund the police. See you later.